Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPAutos.com, your libertarian car guy. Came across an interesting little news item that I thought was worth talking about this morning. It has to do with a test that was performed by Germany's equivalent of AAA, you know, the road service outfit. Anyway, there's something in Germany called ADC, and they did this test of a Volkswagen ID3, which is essentially an electric version of the Golf. You can't get that in the United States right now, but they sell them in Europe. They've been selling them in Europe since about 2020. Anyway, there is this hullabaloo, really positive story about how testing this ID3 in a variety of different circumstances over the course of about 100,000 miles of driving resulted, and I try to say that with italics and irony, in about a 10% loss of the battery's charge capacity. And the tone of it is that somehow that's supposed to be cause for celebration. I don't know about you, but I think I'd be pretty pissed if my truck lost 10% of its range on a full tank, which it hasn't, by the way, and my truck is 24 years old. Still goes the same distance on a tank of gas as it did 24 years ago. But not EVs. You're supposed to be happy about, oh, I only lost 10% of my range. And never mind the fact that when you're talking about most EVs, that's a big deal because most EVs don't come standard with a lot of range. You know, the ID3, for example, has, 200 maybe 50 miles of range, something like that. So 10% is significant, particularly when you also compound that by the fact that EV range is usually optimistic, and because of the hassles of finding a place to charge, having time to charge, hoping the place where you're going to go charge works, it's really important as a practical matter to leave a certain amount of charge in reserve. In other words, it's more risky to run the EV down to quote-unquote fumes than it would be to run a gas-powered vehicle down to fumes. You know, you've probably driven around when the check engine light comes on, and unless you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's like, well, no big deal, I'll just pull over at the next gas station and get some gas, right? But it's a really big deal when, you're pushing the envelope of how much range you've got left in an EV, and you don't know whether you're going to be able to make it to where there's a place to get charged or make it home. So, you typically want to leave 20, 30 miles of indicated range so that you'll actually make it home or to wherever you want to be. But there's another aspect of this that I suspect they didn't include for a reason. And anybody who has had any kind of a battery powered device, I refer to EVs as devices because I think it's accurate. They're essentially scaled up versions of smartphones or even laptops and so on. But anybody who has had a phone or a laptop knows that, for a period of time, the battery will hold a charge and you'll, be able to keep the thing going without keeping it plugged in. But a point comes when you notice that the thing isn't holding charge like it used to. And typically, once that happens, it starts to get worse soon. I recently had to deal with that with my Mac laptop. Initially it seemed like it would go from 100% to like 75% in, 15 minutes. And then shortly thereafter, it would go from an indicated 100% to blank screen in literally a matter of like 5 minutes. And I was able to put a new battery in it because it's, it's inexpensive and worth doing relative to the cost of a new Mac laptop. Of course, with an EV, it's a different matter. On the low end, on the very low end, a new replacement EV battery is typically around $5,000 to $6,000, and that's for something like an older model Nissan Leaf. For a Tesla or anything fancier, you're often talking about 10 grand or more for a battery, so it's significant. So, if you get to a point at 100,000 miles and you're losing about 10% of the charge capacity, I would say it's probably extremely likely that by the time you get to, say, 120, 130,000 miles, probably you're going to have lost considerably more. You might be down to 50%. And then once you get down to 50%, it's pretty much game over for that. And nobody would ever put up with such a thing with conventional vehicles. And this 100,000 mile thing, boy, they really need to catch up. 100,000 miles back in the 70s or even into the 80s, yeah, a car with 100,000 miles on it was getting kind of crickety and getting to the point where it was time to think about getting a new vehicle. But any vehicle made since the late 90s just about that was taken any kind of decent care of, it's common for cars to just barely be broken in, and that's not an exaggeration. at 100,000 miles. And I mean, if you do a compression check on the engine and so on, you'd find that the engine had essentially no meaningful wear on it at 100,000 miles, and it can be counted on to go for another 100,000 miles or even more. Common to get 250, 300,000 miles out of a late model vehicle. So it's disingenuous to act as if, it's a big deal. Oh, I went 100,000 miles and I only lost 10%. Let's see what happens at 150 to 200,000 miles. Just another one of these examples of EP or EV apologia, I guess I'll put it that way. This disingenuous, dishonest coverage by news outlets, by the way, who ought to be in the business of telling you the facts as opposed to suppressing facts, shading facts, trying to get you to see things from their point of view. Anyway, if you're interested in the article, it is up at epautos.com. Hope you'll take a moment to stop by and check it out. And if you have any comments, pro or con, and if you think of something that I didn't think of that wasn't in the article, I'd love to hear about it, so please post comments. And by the way, unlike X, you don't have to provide all your information. There's no paywall, none of that stuff. We actually have free speech and free reach at epautos.com. So thanks, and we'll have more for you again soon.